Good evening, I'm David Nicholas. Next on CMU Public Television, Michigan's DNR Director Keith Creagh joins me on Capitol Report.
Welcome to Capitol Report, a weekly discussion with your elected officials on the issues and concerns that affect you.
Thank you, as always, for being with us. We welcome for the first time to this program the Director of Michigan's Department of Natural Resources, Mr. Keith Creagh. Good to see you, sir, and welcome to our program.
Good to see you, and thanks for having me.
Number one issue, and I'm sure you hear about it in your travels, your phone, your email, and so forth, at least in the public's mind, I would think the number one issue that faces your department, you can confirm or correct this, invasive species, and in particular, Asian carp. Where are we in dealing with the threat, short-term and long-term, as we sit down today?
Well, certainly, that's a great question. And you know, natural resources really define who we are in Michigan. With 20% of the world's fresh water around us, we are the Great Lakes. And one of the biggest threats to the Great Lakes is Asian carp. So what the governor and the Great Lakes Council of Governors are doing as we speak is we're going to meet this weekend to look at how can we best mitigate some of the risks relative to Asian carp. Our friends at the Army Corps came up with something called the Glimmers Report. There were 8 options. One said continue doing what we're doing now, which is not acceptable. One was to do a little bit more education and outreach, which is necessary. And then the other options range somewhere between the $500 million and the $18.3 billion range. And the Corps in the report said that it would take 25 years to get risk reduction. And that is not acceptable. So we're going to meet this week in Chicago with the other Great Lakes Council of Governors, get some better alignment, and then roll up our sleeves and get to work around Asian carp.
What is that working relationship like with the Army Corps and other federal agencies? And I ask that because Cam Davis, who's the EPA Senior Advisor and Administrator for the Great Lakes, recently came to the CMU campus as part of a water symposium, and I asked him generally about that same question, and he said that the search and the monitoring certainly continues, but he says, we've looked, this is a paraphrase, we've looked for them and we cannot find them. So is that an accurate assessment? I mean, when we look at, they're right up to the edge, they're close to the waterway, we've seen some but not many. What is the monitoring telling us?
So it depends on where you're looking if you find them. We certainly have found them in the Mississippi River Basin. They're certainly coming up the Mississippi. They certainly are further ahead than what we'd like them to be. We certainly know that the current mitigation measures in place are not effective. We know that as barges go through the electronic barriers, they warp a bit, you get fish movement, and so that's where our concern is. So as the Corps is looking at alternatives, part of it is where do you establish your risk mitigation? Do you do real-time monitoring? Do you make sure your channels are uniform in nature and don't have cracks and crevices so the electronic barriers are actually efficient? And then how do you get serious about maybe a pinch point at the Brandon Lock and Dam area? And then what's the capacity to do that? And so the states actually are real concerned. Ohio's doing a great job trying to separate some of those flood areas. Indiana's doing a great job trying to separate some of those areas. Governor Quinn in Illinois understands the risk and is trying to build that capacity. The Great Lakes, very specifically, I think what Cam was referring to was the eDNA, environmental DNA sampling that's occurring. All that means is that you have a strand of DNA. It doesn't mean if it's a live fish, a dead fish, a viable population. So that's really what the scientists are looking at. And as you probably know, there's different types of Asian carp. There's 4 different species. Really the one we're worried about is the ones you see on TV that are jumping out of the water, eating at a capacity that would impact other fish in the Great Lakes. And I have to self-confess, I'm a Great Lakes elitist. I don't think we want Asian carp in the Great Lakes. And so 25 years is not acceptable. I appreciate the Michigan legislature, bipartisan, unanimous, said the very same thing. We need to have a pick list, we need to get serious about it, and we need to move it ahead. We then, the governor, through the Great Lakes Council of Governors, is getting alignment. Our congressional delegation, thank you very much to Congressman Dave Camp and Senator Debbie Stabenow. They're working on joint bipartisan legislation that actually moves the ball down the field. The Corps is really primarily dealing with flooding. That's their mission. The Fish and Wildlife Service is really worried about invasive species. So part of the plan is to make sure that the Fish and Wildlife Service is part of the driver, and then the Natural Resource Agency directors and governors and policymakers make sure there's the authorities and the appropriations to solve a problem. And lastly, I'll say what the Corps didn't address in their study was a transportation corridor. That's an important transportation corridor, and we have to make sure we're not disrupting commerce. And I think you can do both. I think you can solve an invasive species problem or concern or challenge, and at the same time make sure that the goods and services that this country needs through the Chicago area continues.
What about the winter that we're emerging from? And this ties not only to the carp, but other invasives that we might have a chance to talk about too. We had more of a freeze, certainly across much of the Great Lakes and our other waterways. Did it alter, and then this gets down to some exact science, maybe we don't know a full assessment yet, but in terms of the ecosystem and how hospitable our Great Lakes waters are going to be, they'll certainly warm up before seasons end again, but is there anything that happened in this period of extended winter and conditions that alters at all the watching and the progress of the carp and the others?
So our fisheries biologists say that the Asian carp is certainly at home in cold water. So the ice cover that was the result of this harsh winter has no bearing on their ability to have reproducing populations. So there's a high degree of confidence that if Asian carp get into the Great Lakes, they will reproduce. There will be populations, and it'll be a challenge for us all. And as you look at the Great Lakes, as you talked about invasives in general, I mean, we can see it with the different quagga mussels, zebra mussels, Phragmites, Eurasian milfoil, you name it, right? It's changing the water column, the clarity, the fisheries. And once it's established, we do not have a very successful track record relative to invasive species. Many of your viewers are now, you know, the subject of some of those ash trees that are falling down because of emerald ash borer. And so as you look around the landscape, the best thing to do is be preventative in nature, be vigilant, and then try to make sure you're reducing that risk as the world shrinks, as we all know it does.
For that list that you ran down, quagga mussels and that whole group, we know they're here. We're watching the Asian carp coming. Are there others that, if you're trying to stay 5-10 steps ahead of the game to know what might be coming, or as ecosystems change and alter, that we should be not getting alarmed or panicking about, but in terms
Right.
of being vigilant and watching for and starting to prepare for it anyway?
Well, Dave, you're exactly right. Alarm and panic doesn't solve the issue. And so let's be vigilant and scientific. And so the governor in the State of the State and in the budget actually proposed $6 million this year and $8 million next year for a more comprehensive invasive species approach. And that's really looking at the pathways, doing the risk analysis. And that would be through my friends at the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, because they do the commerce. And so that's how many of the species gets transported. And then it'll be a joint proposal between the Department of Ag and Rural Development, the Department of Environmental Quality, who does a lot of the beach monitoring and the water permits, and then the Department of Natural Resource. That's kind of the boots on the grounds, the natural resource purveyors, if you will. And so we actually look forward to working with the legislature for the successful completion of that initiative. And that's really based on the citizens getting involved, and then having, I'll say, more local capacity to deliver. We have something called weed cooperative management authorities around the state. And if you do things on a landscape basis, you actually save about 50 cents on the dollar as you start addressing Phragmites or Eurasian milfoil. We need to be good neighbors. We need to make sure we have boat washes. We need to talk to people who are fishing and boating and saying, you know, make sure your trailers are dry, your bilges are pumped out, and that you're not inadvertently transporting it. We need to talk to individuals about, what do you do with your bait? Make sure you're not dumping it back in. What are you doing with some of those crayfish that you're buying for food that look like they're pretty good for smallmouth bass, but they shouldn't be used? And so it's an educational process, but at the same time, it really is engaging the citizens of this state, because they're great natural resource stewards. They pay attention.
It puts us right at the doorstep as we sit down on a Thursday, audience catching up with this conversation on the Tuesday after, but in between sits the opening to a lot of the significant fishing seasons. As with the invasive questions that we've just kind of covered, do we have any expectation for the season as far as the health of the fish population, given the winter that we've had? Are they impacted at all, or does it look like it's going to be a good season coming up?
Well, it'd be a great season, not a good season. So certainly, as DNR director, I'd say get out and fish often. And,
go.
Yeah, make sure you get a license and make sure you have your appropriate safety gear on. But in all seriousness, actually, the rivers are pretty high right now, so you need to be careful when you're out wading in the water or if you have a drift boat. Pay attention to safety. Some of the mouths of the rivers are still blocked with ice, so it's a little bit different than some of the historical openers. But the reports we're getting is that there's plenty of fish out there being caught, plenty of fish in the river, and it should be a great trout opener. And I would remind people that we have redone our license package. And we used to have 2 separate licenses, one for people who trout fished and one who pan fished. And the fish really couldn't tell the difference. So we actually, it's a single license, $25, and it's really to make it, as we say, simple, fair, efficient. Just go fish and have some fun and take your family.
Any other changes to licensing structure, prices, or inclusion levels when we talk about the hunting seasons that are cycling ahead of us too?
Right, and many of your viewers know this. We actually redid both our hunting and fishing licenses. We went from 227 different subtypes of licenses, which seemed a little bit complicated to me. I'm a pretty simple guy. And we actually got it down to about 41. And so on the fishing side, it's a single license. And there's a conversation going on right now about out-of-state versus in-state licenses and how much are being charged, and so we'll perfect that over time. But it's $25 for in-state. There's a single-day license for $10. There's a 3-day license for out-of-state people for $30. So we're still within the ballpark of reasonableness. And I'd remind people we haven't raised our licenses since 1997. And then on the hunting side, what we did is we reduced the small game license. It's called a base license for $10. So anything you could do small game, you can do with a base license. And then it's somewhat of an add-on pick list after that. So then it'd be $20 for each deer license that you would buy, and so on and so forth. So we tried to simplify the system. It does bring in some new revenue. It'll generate about $18 million. Of that $18 million, about 40% of it goes right back into habitat improvement, for either in the fisheries or in the hunting community. So I had 4 counties, for instance, with no COs. That's not acceptable. Lenawee, Hillsdale, Ontonagon, and Genesee. So we were able to build up our capacity around COs. We didn't have a bear biologist in the UP. We were able to, through our stakeholders, it was stakeholder supported, build our capacity. So it really is field staff, boots on the ground, waders in the water, and it's not for administrative overhead. It's for habitat improvement.
One of the hunting seasons just passed. The controversy you're well aware of on both sides of the debate, and that's regarding the wolf hunt. How close are we to assessing its success in managing the herd, and given the natural factors as we come back to the question of the winter that we're coming off of, how long before we know what the overall health and numbers for the wolf herd will be? Yeah,
so first I'd back up one step and say that the reestablishment of wolves in the Upper Peninsula is a success story. And we worked hand in glove with the community to make sure it was a success. But we do have conflict, and it is real. And so the question, partially for the viewers, is we do depredation permits. We give permits to producers in case there's livestock interactions, depredation. We pay wildlife services to shoot wolves when they're causing nuisances. And so part of the conversation was, could hunters be a tool in a toolbox as we try to control those type of conflict situations? So on a landscape basis, we've said from the beginning, we do not want to put the size of the packs in jeopardy in total across the landscape, but we wanted to see if we couldn't influence behavior and solve local conflicts by using hunters in that. So we did. There's 3 management areas. It was based on conflict. Our target harvest was 43. 22 were legally harvested, 11 males, 11 females. They're doing all the necessary research, data collection. The interesting part of it was that the majority of those shot were within 5 miles of a conflict area. Now, does that say we've solved the conflict? It's premature to say that. Does that mean that we're accumulating data to see if we can influence behavior? Absolutely. And so we are committed to scientific game management, and in my opinion, This is a good way to both respect the resource, manage the resource, provide alternatives, and make sure that for the long term, we have a sustained population.
Political debate being what it is, and it probably will continue, how much has this, the sitting there, that debate, impacted how you've been able to do your job? We have legislation that allows for, we have referendums that want to eliminate, we have bills that would make certain things then referendum proof, and back and forth and back and forth. But when it comes down to we enter a season, we're trying to get this done or do any sort of management work on any level, knowing that all these kind of tend to ping pong back and forth, how difficult has that made it to just do any level of the job that needs to be done?
Well, certainly it's always a challenge when there's uncertainty. And so if you have certainty, you can make plans, and you can make plans that are more predictable over time. But having said that, the hunt did not negatively impact the herd, as you've pointed out. So as we flew our transects and we made our counts, there's about 636 wolves, plus or minus about 42 for your confidence interval, right? There used to be 658. So you're within your confidence level. So we'll continue, irrespective of what happens, whether we use hunters as a tool in the toolbox or not, we'll continue to manage the resource in an appropriate and professional manner. So the sooner we have clarity, the sooner then other individuals can make plans if they're part of that solution or not. But as far as managing the conflict in the Upper Peninsula, we'll continue to do that. The Wolf Roundtable met yesterday. The plan stays in place until the certainty of all the ballot initiatives either occur or don't occur. So we'll continue along that path. I would say that, and of course I have a bias, being director of DNR, ballot box biology is not necessarily the best way to run complex issues. So I do think that you need to have a robust public engagement model. And I think you do need to make sure you're professionally and scientifically managed.
Land management itself then, what kind of numbers do we look at in terms of, at this point in time, in 2014, what kinds of acreage are we talking about when it comes to the amount of state land that you are overseeing? And for those that don't know the descriptions of who does what, does this include state forest lands? Does somebody else look over that versus the national forest? When we think of state lands, land management, what comes under your umbrella of what you oversee?
Dave, that's a great question. So I'll back up. I got the best job in state government, right? Because as DNR director, I have a very broad responsibility. So we have the largest freshwater fish portfolio in the world, for instance, right? We have the #1 rated trout stream by Field and Stream magazine. We've got the #1 bass fishing lake rated in the country. I have 102 state parks, 22 million visitors, 1 million camp nights, 4.6 million acres of public land. It's a great resource, and it's a great playground, right? But with it also comes a great responsibility, because we have 4.6 million acres of public land. And one of the things that the governor asked when I came over as DNR director was, we need to have a comprehensive strategy, because there are counties where you and I, as taxpayers, we own 60% of the county. And we being DNR, never really had a thoughtful strategic conversation with those county executives to say, how can we be good neighbors and partners? And so as I went around to the counties, the 10 counties with the most state land within its boundaries, it was a fascinating conversation. It wasn't the amount, it was the footprint. So they might have needed a trailhead in one part of their county, but they would have liked maybe a parcel along a major road, or a lake view lot, not lake access, but a lake view lot back on the tax rolls. So we had that conversation. We had the conversation about having trails that go one way and not connect into the town. So if a town loses a state park, it can shut a town down. It is an economic driver. And so how do you connect the natural resources with local businesses and then make sure you have a quality of life? I'm up in Sheboygan County. They're talking about water trails and trails along the waterways. And then how can you put coffee shops, bicycle shops, small areas where you could maybe spend the night, and then drive healthcare costs because you're more fit? That's a great conversation to have. And so that's part of the whole public lands management strategy. The legislature, they were questioning how much we owned, where we owned it. And so we were really encouraged and compelled to have a strategy. So we put it together, had a great steering committee, had everyone from Michigan Environmental Council, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, Trout Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited, Chevron, some of the timber industry, some of the economic development, NEMCOG, Northeast Michigan Council of Governments, SEMCOG, Oakland County Parks. That entire group agreed with the strategy. And so we'll work with the legislature to move that forward. And our commitment is to engage appropriately at the local level.
One aspect of that then too, about 5 minutes left, is looking at the management of the mineral rights that are under those lands. And I understand we're kind of in the juncture as, again, we sit down and the program comes to our viewers of another one of those auctions when it comes to mineral rights. Any change from the past in terms of what we're looking at, particular targeted lands? What is planned for in and around May 1st? So
May 1st, there's another auction. The auction's mainly down in the Genesee County area, in the Thumb area. And so you and I, we own the mineral rights under many of the state parks, state lands, and so Bill Milliken set up something called the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund, where you take a non-renewable resource and in the money that you get off oil and gas sales, if you will, in minerals, it goes into the trust fund. Trust fund then buys high asset properties. So if you're accessing the Great Lakes, many of the state parks were trust fund dollars purchased. So that construct is a really good concept. What's happening at this point in time is there's a little controversy around hydraulic fracturing, as you know, high volume hydraulic fracturing, which is regulated by DEQ. So there's been some fairly pointed conversations at our Natural Resources Commission meeting. We do the oil and gas leasing, which doesn't necessarily mean production and permitting, right? That's through the Department of Environmental Quality. However, we have a role to play because we do the environmental assessment, and any of the parklands, recreation lands, that's all leasable non-development. And what that means is that you, as a private individual, if you put down a well next to it, the citizens of this state get compensated as the gas and oil move through the soil profile. Fairly complex, things to still learn. One of the things the governor's asked for is a full study of hydraulic fracturing by the University of Michigan, Graham Sustainability Institute. They're doing their assessment. Those reports will be out. And I think there are ways we can improve over time with information, disclosure, and certainty in the process. Taxpayers deserve it. It's a good thing, but oil and gas exploration is not new to this state. We've done it for decades.
In our last couple of minutes, and is there a way, when you talked about the separation of your role and that of DEQ, and knowing that at one time it was all one department and with the separation, is there any way that would make it easier to, when you look at something as complex or complicated, potentially as controversial as that, of blending the roles in a different way to streamline the process for the benefit of those that are concerned about the environmental risk with those that want to look at the energy development and moving that whole process forward? So the construct in state government right now is the Department of Ag, Environmental Quality, and Natural Resources are come together under the Quality of Life umbrella. We are compelled to work together in those complex issues because no one agency can solve it themselves. And by making sure we bring to bear our appropriate expertise, we actually get a better decision at the end of the day. So we do the environmental assessment, if you will, the ecological assessment, fisheries, wildlife, forestry, surface, and then DEQ looks at the hydrology and the water assessment tools. So actually it's a good system to have, and we look forward to having that conversation. It's a quick half hour. I hope that with the 127 corridor literally running past our door, that as you travel back and forth up into northern Michigan, we'll have a chance to welcome you back. Certainly appreciate your time today and raising the #1 banner there for all that Pure Michigan celebrates here. Good to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'll be back anytime.
All right. Thanks very much. And thank you for your time and attention as well. We've been talking with DNR Director Keith Creagh here on Capitol Report. Our program will be repeated tonight in the overnight lineup and soon posted to our website. Go to WCMU.org, click on WCMU Productions, and that will take you to the specific link for our series here and for all the past programs in this present season. For our technical director, Chris Ogazali, and all of our crew here, I'm David Nicholas. Appreciate your time and attention, and we'll talk again soon.
You've been watching Capitol Report. Join us again as your elected officials speak to your concerns on current issues.